The warning sirens screamed across the Shaprime like dying animals. Elder Cathara pressed her long blue fingers against the cold metal wall and felt the vibrations shake through her bones. Another blast. The Vorthok were getting closer. She walked through the empty halls of the High Council building. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. 6 months ago, these halls buzzed with activity. Diplomats from 7 different worlds worked together, planning trade routes and cultural exchanges. Now, the building was almost empty. Most of the council members had fled to the outer colonies or died defending their homeworlds. Cathara stopped at a large window and looked out at the city below. Smoke rose from several districts. The blue sky was filled with streaks of red laser fire as their defense ships fought desperately against the Vorthok fleet. She could see the enemy ships in the distance. They looked like giant metal insects. All angles and sharp edges, they moved in perfect formation. Like they shared one mind. The Vorthok had appeared 3 years ago from the dark space between galaxies. Nobody knew where they came from or what they wanted. They just started conquering everything in their path. Their biomechanical soldiers never got tired, never retreated, and never showed mercy. They turned captured worlds into factory planets that built more of their kind. The Zephyrian Collective had tried everything. They built bigger weapons, but the Vorthok adapted to them within days. They formed alliances with warrior races, but the Vorthok overwhelmed them with numbers. They tried diplomatic contact, but the Vorthok only responded with more attacks. Now 90% of collective space was under enemy control. Cathara walked away from the window and headed deeper into the building. She had one last idea, something she had found in the old archives 3 weeks ago. It was probably foolish, but they had no other choice. The archive vault was buried 5 levels underground. The heavy metal door recognized her genetic signature and slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, thousands of data crystals lined the walls, each one containing centuries of collected knowledge. The collective had been exploring space for over 2,000 years. They had met hundreds of different species and cataloged millions of worlds. She moved to the restricted section in the back corner. These files were classified, deemed too dangerous or disturbing for general access. Her security clearance barely allowed her to be here. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The file she wanted was labeled with symbols she barely recognized. The translation software identified it as Emergency Protocols, Last Resort Communications Array. She inserted the crystal into a reader and waited for the ancient data to load. That the information made her scales tingle with fear and hope. Deep in space, hidden among asteroids at the edge of their galaxy, was a quantum communications beacon. It had been built by a species called the Ancients over 50,000 years ago. The beacon could send messages across the vast emptiness between galaxies. Most interesting was a log entry from a collective explorer named Verdan, who had discovered the beacon 800 years ago. He had detected a signal coming from a distant galaxy called the Milky Way. The signal pointed to a small blue world in the outer arm of that galaxy. Verdan had tried to translate the signal, but could only make out fragments. The world was inhabited by a species the ancient database called Deathworld survivors. The file contained warnings in 17 different languages. Phrases like extreme caution advised and psychological evaluation required before contact appeared throughout the text. But there was also something else. Combat effectiveness. Ratings that were so high, they seemed impossible. Cathara read through combat reports from other species who had encountered these humans in small numbers. A single human soldier had held off an entire battalion of Krell warriors for 6 hours. Human ships regularly performed maneuvers that should have killed their crews from acceleration forces. Human colonies had survived on planets where the local wildlife included creatures that ate starship hulls. But what really caught her attention was a note about human psychology. According to the files, humans became more effective in combat when facing overwhelming odds. They actually got stronger when they were afraid or angry. The report called it stress enhancement response and marked it as biologically impossible, but empirically confirmed. Another explosion shook the building, closer this time. Cathara made her decision. She authorized an emergency council session through the quantum network. Within minutes, holographic projections of the surviving council members appeared around the conference table. There were only 12 left out of the original 47. Fellow council members, she began, our situation is hopeless. Our fleets are broken, our worlds are lost, and our people are dying. But I have found something in the archives. A chance, perhaps our only chance. She explained about the beacon in the distant world called Earth. She shared the combat reports and the psychological profiles. Some council members looked skeptical. Others seemed horrified by what they read about human warfare capabilities. These humans sound like monsters, said Counselor Zethan from his refugee ship. Perhaps worse than the Vorthok. Maybe Kethra replied, but monsters who fight other monsters might be exactly what we need. The debate lasted for hours while the battle raged outside. In the end, fear won over caution. The vote was 8 in favor, 4 against. Kethra personally traveled to the beacon in a small stealth ship. The ancient device was larger than expected, a crystalline structure the size of a city floating in empty space. It took her technical team 6 days to figure out how to activate it safely. When the beacon finally powered up, it sang with harmonics that seemed to reach across the universe itself. Kethra stood before the communication array and spoke the words that would either save or doom her people. To the humans of Earth, she said in the clearest galactic standard she could manage, we are the Zephyrian Collective. We are dying. Great evil has come to our galaxy, and we cannot stop it alone. We have heard that you are strong, that you fight when others run. We prayed for heroes to save us. If you can hear this message, if you have any mercy in your hearts, please help us. Our children are dying. Our worlds are burning. We have nowhere else to turn. She repeated the message in 17 different languages, then added the location coordinates of the ship Prime. The beacon transmitted the signal across the void between galaxies and fell silent. Now all they could do was wait and hope that someone was listening. 6 months later, as the Vorthok prepared their final assault on the Sia Prime, 3 unknown ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. They were smaller than expected, built more for speed than raw firepower. The lead ship opened a communication channel. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Colonial Defense Force, came the voice in accented but understandable galactic standard. We got your message. Sorry we're late, but traffic was murder coming through the void. Permission to come aboard and discuss how we can help with your little pest problem. Elder Cathara stared at the holographic display, showing the 3 human ships. They were nothing like what she had expected. The vessels were sleek and angular, but they seemed small compared to the massive Vorthok dreadnoughts surrounding Desha Prime. Each ship was maybe half the size of a standard collective cruiser. Are you certain these are the Deathworld survivors? Asked Counselor Zethan through the communication link. They look rather ordinary. Admiral Lisa Carter materialized in the council chamber as a blue hologram. She was tall for a human, with short brown hair and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a dark blue uniform with silver insignia that Kethra didn't recognize. Thank you for responding to our message, Kethra said, bowing in the traditional Zephyrian greeting. I am Elder Kethra of the High Council. We are grateful that you came, but I must warn you. The enemy fleet outnumbers you by more than 1,000 to 1. Admiral Carter smiled, and Kethra felt an odd chill. There was something predatory about that expression, like a hunting animal that had just spotted prey. Ma'am, we appreciate the warning, Carter said. But we didn't come here to match numbers. We came here to solve a problem. Before we start shooting, though, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Mind if we take a closer look at these Vorthok? Cathara nodded quickly. Of course, but please be careful. They adapt to new threats very quickly. We have lost many ships trying to gather intelligence. Don't worry about us, Carter replied. We're pretty good at not being seen when we don't want to be. The hologram flickered and disappeared. Within minutes, the 3 human ships had vanished from all sensors. Even the most advanced collective scanning equipment couldn't detect them. It was as if they had simply stopped existing. On the bridge of the UCS Valiant, Captain Jake Morrison studied the tactical displays with interest. His ship was currently hiding inside the sensor shadow of a small moon, completely invisible to both Vorthok and Zephyrian detection systems. "What do you think, Colonel?" Morrison asked the man standing beside him. Colonel Ryan Martinez was a broad-shouldered man with dark hair and scars on his hands that spoke of many battles. He had been studying video feeds of Vorthok ground forces for the past hour. "They fight like computers, sir," Martinez said. "Perfect formations, textbook maneuvers, everything by the book. Look at this." He pointed to a screen showing Vorthok biomechanical soldiers advancing on a Zephyrian defensive position. The enemy moved in precise geometric patterns, each unit, maintaining exact distances from the others. When Zephyrian forces tried to flank them, the Vorthok responded with a perfect countermaneuver that looked like it came from a military academy textbook. "They're sharing information instantly," Martinez continued, "probably through some kind of quantum link. When one unit learns something, they all learn it immediately. That's why they adapt so fast to new weapons." Dr. Amy Brooks looked up from her workstation. She was a small woman with red hair and thick glasses, but her reputation as a xenobiologist was legendary throughout human space. "I've been analyzing their technology," she said. "It's impressive, but it has a major weakness. Everything is connected to everything else. They don't have individual decision-making protocols. Each unit waits for instructions from the collective before acting." "What happens if we disrupt their communications?" asked Major Pete Sullivan. He was leaning against a bulkhead, cleaning his sidearm with the casual ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. "Theoretically, they should become confused and ineffective," Brooks replied. "But we'd need to get close enough to introduce some kind of interference pattern into their network." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "What about their ships?" On another screen, they could see the Vorthok fleet. Hundreds of dark vessels hung in space like sleeping giants. Each ship was a work of mechanical art, all smooth curves and deadly weapon arrays. They moved in formations so perfect they looked like a single organism. "Same problem," said Lieutenant Commander Kate Phillips from the pilot's station. "They fly like they're all controlled by one mind. Perfect coordination, but no individual initiative. If something unexpected happens, they all have to wait for new orders from the collective." Morrison walked to the main view screen and stared out at the enemy fleet. Behind him, his crew worked with quiet efficiency. These men and women had fought pirates in the asteroid belt, hostile aliens in the Vega system, and each other during the colony wars. They had learned that the universe was a dangerous place where only the strong and the clever survived, said Sergeant Danny Torres from the Marine section. "I've been watching their ground tactics. They're strong and they're tough, but they fight like they've never faced anything that didn't make sense." Torres was a compact man with olive skin and dark eyes that missed nothing. He had earned his stripes fighting in the tunnels of Mars and the jungles of New Panama. "What do you mean?" Morrison asked. "They expect their enemies to be logical," Torres explained. "Look at these battle recordings. Try something unpredictable." The Vorthok paused for several seconds before responding. They have to wait for the collective to analyze the new tactic and send back instructions. Dr. Brooks suddenly straightened up at her station. "Captain, I think I found something important." She transferred her data to the main screen. It showed a detailed analysis of Vorthok biomechanical systems. "Their adaptive algorithms are incredibly sophisticated," she said, "but they're designed to counter logical threats. Mathematical targeting systems, energy-based weapons, standard military tactics. The computer models they use assume their enemies will behave rationally. And humans don't behave rationally in combat," Morrison said with growing interest. "Exactly," Brooks replied. "We're the only species I know of that gets more dangerous when we're scared or angry. Most intelligent life forms become less effective. Under stress, we become more creative." Major Sullivan laughed, a sound like broken glass. "So you're saying these metal bugs have never fought anyone crazy enough to charge machine gun nests while screaming battle songs?" "I don't think they've ever fought anyone who wasn't entirely sane," Brooks confirmed. Morrison returned to his command chair and activated the communication system. "Admiral Carter, this is Morrison. We've completed our reconnaissance." Carter's Voice came back immediately. What's your assessment, Captain? Ma'am, I believe we can handle this situation with minimal casualties on our side. The enemy has superior numbers and technology, but they have a critical weakness in their tactical programming. Explain. Morrison smiled, and his bridge crew smiled with him. They all recognized that particular expression. It meant someone was about to have a very bad day. They've never fought humans before, ma'am. They don't know what we're capable of when we stop following the rules. There was a pause, then Carter's voice came back with what sounded like satisfaction. Begin Phase 1, Captain. Let's introduce ourselves properly. The 3 human ships dropped their stealth systems and appeared on every sensor in the system. But instead of attacking or retreating, they began to do something that made no sense to anyone watching. They started to dance. The human ships moved like nothing Elder Cathara had ever seen. The UCS Liberty spun in a tight spiral while firing its engines in random bursts. The UCS Titan flew in figure-8 patterns that seemed to violate basic physics. The UCS Valiant appeared to fold space around itself, vanishing and reappearing in impossible locations. What are they doing? Counselor Zethan demanded through the communication link. His voice carried a mix of confusion and panic. Are they malfunctioning? Kethera watched the tactical display with growing amazement. The Vorthok fleet, which had maintained perfect formation for months, was starting to drift apart. Individual ships were turning at odd angles, as if they couldn't decide which human vessel to target first. I think, she said slowly there, confusing the enemy. On the bridge of the UCS Valiant, Captain Morrison was having the time of his life. His ship's gravity compensators screamed in protest as he put the vessel through maneuvers that no sane pilot would attempt. Kate, take us. Through that asteroid field, he ordered. Make it look like we're running away. Lieutenant Commander Phillips grinned as she pushed the engines past their safety limits. With pleasure, sir. Want me to add some barrel rolls for style? Absolutely, Morrison replied. The more confused they get, the better this works. Doctor? Brooks monitored the enemy communications from her station. Captain, the Vorthok Collective is going crazy. Their tactical computers are trying to process over 3,000 different threat scenarios simultaneously. They can't decide if we're attacking, retreating, or having some kind of mechanical failure. Major Sullivan's voice crackled over the intercom from the Marine Bay. Sir, request permission to launch ground assault teams. Torres has some ideas about how to really mess with their heads. Permission granted, Morrison said. But remember, we want them confused, not dead. Not yet. Anyway, Sergeant Torres led 50 Marines in assault pods toward the largest Vorthok ground installation on Detcha Prime. The pods were designed to look like debris from destroyed ships. As they fell toward the planet's surface, Torres briefed his teams. Over the radio, listen up, people, he said in his calm, steady voice. These metal bugs think war is supposed to make sense. Our job is to prove them wrong when we land. I want chaos. I want noise. I want them so confused they forget which way is up. The assault pods crashed into the Vorthok perimeter like meteorites. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Like the biomechanical. Sentries scanned the smoking craters with their sensors, trying to determine if the debris was dangerous. Then Torres and his Marines erupted from the wreckage. Like demons from hell, they came out screaming, not the organized battle cries of professional soldiers, but wild primal howls that seemed to come from the deepest parts of human evolution. Some Marines beat on their armor with rifle butts, creating a thunderous rhythm. Others fired their weapons into the air while laughing like madmen. Private Ben Clark, a farm boy from Iowa who had joined the Marines to see the galaxy, to charge directly at a Vorthok unit that was 3 times his size. Instead of using his rifle, he pulled out a standard-issue lunch tray and began beating the mechanical creature with it, while shouting something about his grandmother's cooking. The Vorthok collective mind tried desperately to process what it was seeing. The threat assessment algorithms worked overtime, analyzing human behavior patterns and finding nothing that matched their databases. These creatures were charging fortified positions without cover. They were using non-military equipment as weapons, They seemed to be enjoying themselves. Corporal Danny Rodriguez discovered that Vorthok sensors had trouble tracking targets that moved erratically. He began dancing while he fought, spinning and leaping between enemy units like he was at a festival, instead of a battlefield. His rifle fire was deadly accurate despite his constant motion. Torres de Morrison, the sergeant's voice came over the radio. "Sir, we've taken the perimeter. The enemy is pulling back, but they're not retreating in formation. They're just running in random directions." Morrison smiled as he watched the tactical display. The perfect Vorthok battle lines were dissolving into chaos. Units were breaking formation to chase individual Marines who led them on wild chases through the installation's corridors. "Phase 2, Kate," he ordered, "take us into their fleet." Phillips pushed the Valiant straight toward the center of the Vorthok formation. Behind them, the Liberty and Titan followed in completely unpredictable flight patterns. The enemy ships tried to target them, but their targeting computers couldn't lock onto vessels that refused to fly in straight lines. Dr. Brooks worked frantically at her station. "I'm ready, Captain. Just get me close to their command ship." The Valiant swooped between two Vorthok dreadnoughts like a bird flying between trees. Energy beams lashed out from every direction, but the human ship seemed to anticipate each shot and dance away at the last second. "Now, Amy," Morrison shouted. Brooks launched a single data probe toward the enemy command vessel. It looked like ordinary space debris, just another piece of metal floating in the battle zone. The Vorthok sensors ignored it completely. The probe attached itself to the command ship's hull and began broadcasting. But instead of jamming the enemy communications, it did something much worse. It introduced what Brooks called a chaos virus into their tactical network. The virus didn't destroy anything. Instead, it made the Vorthok units randomly switch between 17 different combat protocols every few seconds. One moment they would be in defensive formation, the next they would try to charge, then they would attempt to retreat. Then they would start a flanking maneuver that went nowhere. Lieutenant Commander Phillips piloted her fighter through the heart of a Vorthok battlecruiser. The enemy point defense systems tried to track her, but she was flying in patterns that made no mathematical sense. She rolled upside down, flew backwards for several seconds, then corkscrewed through a gap that was barely wider than her ship as she emerged from the other side of the enemy vessel. Phillips looked back and laughed. "Sorry about that," she said. "Over the radio, I was trying to spell my name with the flight path. Did anyone see if I got the P right?" On the surface, Torres received reports from his squad leaders. The Vorthok ground forces were in complete disarray. Units that had fought with mechanical precision for 3 years were now wandering aimlessly, unable to coordinate their actions. "Boss," called Private Clark over the radio, "I think I broke one of their big robots with a spoon. Is that normal?" Torres looked at the biomechanical unit Clark had been fighting. It was standing motionless, its optical sensors flashing randomly while it made soft beeping sounds. The collective mind was so overloaded with conflicting data that individual units were starting to shut down. "Yeah," Clark Torres replied. "That's pretty normal for us." Above the planet, the Vorthok fleet was coming apart. Ships collided with each other as they tried to execute contradictory orders. Some vessels fired on their own allies when the chaos virus convinced them that friendly units were actually enemies. Admiral Rose's voice came over the fleet communication system. "All units, this is Admiral Carter. The enemy is broken. Begin. Phase 3. Let's finish this." The 3 human ships stopped their wild maneuvers and formed up into a proper attack formation. But by then, it was too late for the Vorthok to respond. Their fleet was scattered, their ground forces were paralyzed, their collective mind was drowning in chaos. The beings who had conquered 90% of the galaxy in 3 years were about to learn what happened when you fought creatures who thrived on confusion and turned madness into a weapon. The war that had lasted 3 years ended on a Tuesday afternoon with what humans would later call the most polite surrender in galactic history. Captain Morrison sat in the conference room aboard the UCS Valiant, watching as 3 Vorthok delegation members tried to maintain their dignity while their biomechanical bodies trembled with what could only be described as electronic fear. The largest of the 3, Apparently, their spokesperson kept making soft, clicking sounds that Dr. Brooks had identified as their equivalent of nervous laughter. "We acknowledge defeat," the lead Vorthok said in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "The collective mind has concluded that further resistance would be illogical. We request terms for surrender." Admiral Carter leaned back in her chair and studied the delegation with the same expression she might use when looking at interesting insects. "Terms are simple," she said. "You return all conquered territory to the Zephyrian Collective immediately. You pay reparations for damages, and you never, ever attack anyone in this galaxy again." "These terms are acceptable," the Vorthok replied quickly, "but we must ask, what are you?" Morrison couldn't help but smile. "We're humans. We come from a little blue planet called Earth. We heard someone needed help with a pest problem." The second Vorthok delegate spoke up, its optical sensors flickering rapidly. "We have analyzed your combat methods for 6 standard days. Your tactics violate 17 fundamental principles of warfare. Your flight patterns defy basic physics. Ground forces use kitchen utensils as weapons. This is not possible." Dr. Brooks looked up from her tablet where she had been documenting. "Vorthok's surrender terms. Which part isn't possible? The physics violations or the kitchen utensils?" "All of it," the third delegate said. "Our combat algorithms can predict the behavior of any rational species within acceptable parameters. But you are not rational. You become more effective when you should become less effective. You laugh when you should be afraid. You attack when you should retreat. This does not compute." Colonel Martinez, who had been quietly listening from the app corner, spoke up. "Son, if you think this was bad, you should see what we do when we're really angry." The lead Vorthok made those clicking sounds again. "We have no desire to discover that information. We will comply with all surrender terms and withdraw from collective space immediately." The formal surrender took place on the Shaw Prime 3. Days later, Elder Cathara stood beside Admiral Carter as hundreds of Vorthok ships began their withdrawal from the system. The alien ships moved slowly and carefully, making no sudden movements that might be interpreted as aggressive. "I still cannot believe it worked," Cathara said, watching the enemy fleet depart. 3 ships defeated an empire that conquered half the galaxy. "Numbers don't always matter," Carter replied. "Sometimes you just need the right approach to the problem." Sergeant Torres appeared at Carter's shoulder, his armor still bearing scorch marks from the ground assault. "Ma'am, the Vorthok have finished dismantling their installations on the surface. They left behind some of their technology as part of the reparations package. Dr. Brooks is having a field day studying it. Any casualties from our side?" Carter asked. 2 bruised egos and 1 mild concussion when Private Clark tried to headbutt a Vorthok unit to prove it was possible, Torres reported. "The Vorthok got the worst end of that exchange. I think Clark cracked its optical sensor." Cathara stared. "At the human sergeant? Your soldier attacked an armored war machine with his head." "Ma'am, with respect, that's actually pretty normal for Clark," Torres replied seriously. "Last month he arm wrestled a mining robot on asteroid station Charlie 7. 1, 2. Dr. Brooks joined the group carrying a tablet filled with technical data. "Admiral, I've finished the preliminary analysis of Vorthok technology. Their adaptive systems are incredibly advanced, but they're completely dependent on logical input. When we introduced random variables into their calculations, their entire network couldn't handle the processing load. So we broke their brains by being ourselves," Morrison said as he approached the group. "Essentially, yes," Brooks confirmed. "They've never encountered a species that uses chaos as a tactical advantage. Their collective mind literally couldn't compute our behavior patterns." Major Sullivan walked up carrying what looked like a Vorthok weapon component. "Found this in one of their abandoned positions. Thought you might want to see it, Doc." Brooks examined the device with interest. "Fascinating. It's a tactical analysis computer designed to predict enemy movements. Look at this damage pattern. The circuits are actually burned out from overloading." "What overloaded it?" Cathara asked. According to the data logs, it was trying to calculate the probability curve for Sergeant Torres, teaching his squad to perform combat maneuvers while singing an ancient Earth song called Sweet Caroline, Brooks replied with a straight face. Torres grinned. "That song's got good rhythm for suppressing fire patterns." 3 weeks later, A formal alliance ceremony took place on the neutral station of Deep Space Nine. Representatives from all surviving collective worlds attended, along with delegations from several other species who had heard about the human victory. Admiral Carter stood before the assembled diplomats and signed the Terran-Zephyrian Mutual Defense Pact. The document established permanent cooperation between Earth and the collective, including technology exchanges and mutual protection agreements. "The galaxy is a dangerous place," Carter said in her speech to the assembly, "but it's a lot less dangerous when you have friends watching your back." Elder Cathara approached the podium next. "6 months ago, we sent a message into the void, asking for heroes. The universe sent us something better. It sent us allies who showed us that sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem is to stop thinking about it as impossible." Dr. Brooks established a research exchange program between Earth universities and collective science institutes. Her first joint project involved studying how different species approached problem-solving under stress.
All of the preliminary results
Suggested that humans were unique in their ability to become more creative when facing life-threatening situations. Colonel Martinez remained on Thesha Prime to train collective defense forces in what became known as flexible response tactics. His first lesson involved teaching Zephyrian soldiers how to use improvised weapons and think creatively under pressure. The key, he explained to a class of confused alien recruits, is to stop trying to make sense and start making trouble. Lieutenant Helen Price took command of a small human garrison stationed at the edge of collective space. Her mission was simple: remind the galaxy that humanity was watching. Her troops became legendary for their creative interpretations of keeping the peace. The Vorthok Empire, meanwhile, retreated to the far edge of the galaxy and began what their historians would later call the Great Recalculation. They spent years trying to develop new algorithms that could account for irrational behavior, but always concluded that such mathematics were impossible. A year after the war ended, Elder Cathara updated the ancient archives. Where the entry had once read "Deathworld survivors," she wrote a new description. "Humans, they turned chaos into victory and showed us that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to dance through it while laughing." The final entry in her report read, "Note for future generations: if you ever need help with an impossible situation, call the humans. But be prepared for them to solve it in ways you never imagined possible." In the margin, she added a personal note. They prayed for heroes, but the universe gave them something infinitely more valuable: friends who happened to be the most beautifully insane warriors in existence. And in the deepest archives, marked "For emergency access only," she placed one last message: warning to future threats. Humanity is always watching. They think your doomsday plans are adorable.